Hey folks, uh, Anthony should be here any minute. Um, he's he's AWOL.
Yo, I'm sorry I was late.
You look
I was
different.
oh, I changed my PFP because it's a blimp. I don't know if you can see. It's kind of like a anthropomorphic blimp.
Yeah, it's like a fat axolotl.
That's yeah, that's a very deep cut, but yes, that's correct. Can a man change his PFP? Just feeling cute.
He should and can
Exactly.
and will.
Exactly. Exactly. So where are you? You're not in your car. That leaves
I'm in Montana right now.
not in the car though.
No, I'm in a
In like a
house.
structure.
I'm in a house. Yeah, I'm in a
Look at
structure. Yep, we got has a
Look at
roof.
you.
I
La
know,
di
for
da.
once.
La di da.
Well, when we were discussing this through our attorneys and what we were going to do on this space, we talked about just what lore? What do you want to intro
Well,
what we're
I
going
was
to do
thinking, okay,
here?
so you and I, yeah, for background for everybody, Roslet and I, did we start at Tlon kind of at the same time?
Yeah, I think I was very shortly after
Yeah,
you.
so we kind of started working on Urbit full time, basically at the same time. So I was thinking we can kind of like interview each other and give a sense of what those kind of early days were.
Yeah,
Interesting
and
stuff.
I think it'd also be fun to do a little bit of like personal
Oh,
origin story, just because I think yours is interesting.
interesting. Okay, well, why don't you do me first?
Yeah.
Or.
Well, I'm gonna go way back. So like where'd you grow up?
Where did I grow up? I grew up in Palos
Yeah.
Verdes, which is a suburb of Los Angeles to the south. It was immortalized in a movie called The Stoned Age. But I grew up in kind of like a Fast Times in at Ridgemont High style Southern California, very stereotypical, almost like a joke at this point type environment. So I grew up in a kind of isolated suburb that was based mostly on surfing and that's basically it. yeah. Yeah, I did not surf.
Were you a
No,
surfer?
I'm not surf. I actually, so this is the kind of like California micro geography. Back in the day, there'd be like we lived on this hill, and one side of the hill was facing the ocean, like right on the ocean, and the other side of the hill was obviously on the other side of the ocean. And the people on the ocean facing the side of the hill had been like surfing since they were like 6 with their dads. And I grew up on the non-ocean side of the hill. And so by the time I even like understood what was going on, everyone was like a professional surfer. So it was like, okay, well, I'm not going to go like just be a kook, which is slang for a non-surfer who tries to surf. So
Cook
Kick slams,
slams.
exactly. So I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna not do that. But I played music from a very early age, so I kind of like my role was more like I was in bands with a lot of the guys who surfed, but I was not myself a surfer. So I was like kind of got a pass for not being a surfer. But and where I grew up though, it was like very much like it's funny every once in a while there's like a movie depiction of it or like a fictional depiction of it, but it was like very territorial. So it's like if you weren't from that area, you're gonna surf in that area, your tires would get slashed. People would take a dump on your
Oh.
car. That was a very famous one. Someone just taking a dump on your car. And like it's not like kids were doing it, the adults of the group were doing it. So like multiple generations of surf hoodlums. So but I was able to go because I like played bass in their various jam bands that they all, of course, were in.
So it doesn't really sound like you were like noodling
I
on
absolutely
computers
was.
as
I
a child.
actually, I was anti. I was one of those guys like this is a fad. You know what I mean? Like, what I'm gonna learn how to fucking type. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like didn't learn how to type really until college because I was just like, why? You know what I mean? I just didn't. I was like, am I gonna fucking word
Mhm.
process? You know what I mean? I just didn't even understand why you would want to learn how to type, like touch type. So I was like, two finger typer probably till I was 19 or something like that. And yeah, I actually had no interest in computers whatsoever, probably till I was like in my mid 20s or so. And then I'd always played music, and I sort of got interested in producing electronic music, and that's kind of how I got into computers. And so I sort of got interested in various kinds of software used to produce music. So the one that really got me going was there's this software program called Ableton Live, which now is very famous, but at the time was not used very widely. One thing you could do with this software is like through various kind of like hacks. write Python scripts that would allow you to do kind of like more elaborate stuff with the software. You could kind of extend it a little bit. And so that's kind of how I started programming, was just through music, and then the various software things from there. I kind of like went down the hole. So most of my programming was kind of just ad hoc, but I started to learn about computers that way, and that was kind of like my entree to it. And then when I was in graduate school,
For literature, by the way,
for
right?
comparative literature, yeah, which is like
Yeah.
even whacker than normal literature. But what's good about comparative literature is no one like knows what it is, so you can kind of do whatever you want, if that makes sense. Like there's no real curriculum, so you kind of just had free reign just to do whatever you want. And so I ended up taking a class in what was at that time called computational linguistics, which was, what later became called natural language processing. So I started taking this class, and I was like, programming because of that. And I basically was like, this is not that hard. I kind of like bought the line that, computers were very esoteric. And certainly if you were someone who was not like, didn't have a technical background, didn't have a math background, etc., do not even try, right? Leave it to the adults type thing. And I was in this class, and I looked around. I'm like, these people don't know shit. Like, I mean, it's just very easy. And so that's kind of when I was like, I'm a graduate student. I'm very broke. I tell everyone this story. I was like comparison shopping like cans of beans. It's like, okay, well, the Mexican cans of beans are like slightly cheaper. And if you go into this one bin, they're the ones that have been like thrown off the truck. They're like dented, and they'll sell it to you. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is not this is not a sustainable way to live, And so I was like, okay, well, fuck it, I'm going to learn to code. And I basically just taught myself. I didn't really have any, I just kind of like took up little projects, and like would do my graduate school stuff kind of during the day. And then at night would just kind of like give myself little coding projects and just bang through them, mostly based on language manipulation. The Twitter API had opened up, so you can kind of like get all of this language and just start like messing around with it and doing data mining stuff, and just kind of basic stuff. But I did a lot of stuff like that, and then eventually I got good enough that I was like, you know what, I'm gonna like look for jobs doing this. And I ended up, I have like a sort of con man like air to me. You probably could attest to this. So I can kind of like go into an office, go into an interview, and be like, yeah, I could just, I could code some shit. You know what I mean? Like, and so I went in, and I was able to land a job working at kind of like what ended up being a subcontractor for a defense contractor. And they had me doing like pretty much defense level data mining. So spying on people essentially.
And and this was actually your first paid job
Yeah, I had taught at the
doing
university. Yeah, I had
anything,
like taught at the university, but
right?
that was like, basically you were a servant. You know what I mean? Like it was not really a job. So
Mhm.
that was kind of my first programming job. I'd done some stuff. I'd done some like contract work, but that's kind of where I got my chops, and that's was my entree into quote unquote the technology industry. And so I just sort of did that, and it became apparent pretty early on that like I was probably better at talking to the clients and like wrangling what people should do. And you could put me in a room in front of government types or industry types, and I wouldn't totally crap the bed. And so I sort of just failed up, as as they say. So I got taken off the programming, which I was never very good at, and became essentially a manager, like a product manager, which at the time was
Mhm.
like, managing some programmers, but also dealing with the relationship with the client. And that went on for a little bit. And then I ended up starting doing more stuff with hardware. So we also did stuff that like, that interface with like robotics. So we'd write this software and then also have like robots that would deploy it or use it in the data pipeline. So yeah, so I kind of within a few years, I was managing teams of combination of roboticists, designers, data engineer type people, data pipeline type people. And so, yeah, that was kind of where I cut my teeth, as it were, in management, was managing these small groups of people to do kind of basically prototyping, leading up to giving a presentation to like someone in defense, someone in the government, someone in industry. And, their minds are actually very easily blown because the kind of stuff they do most of the day is pretty boring. So if you show up and you're like, hey, me and this team of guys made this drone that can like fly over your crops and see how much soil moisture there is by the reflective, by the level of the albedo, the reflectiveness of the soil, they're just like beside themselves, right? They're like, holy shit, you're a genius.
Would you say that's like a good example or like maybe a typical example of stuff that you were solving for? I mean,
Yeah, I kind of fell
it,
into the niche after the defense stuff, because our firm did stuff that was for defense, but we also did for pretty much all sorts of large Fortune 500 type companies, so pretty big companies. So I kind of became the agriculture guy at some point. People get the wrong idea. Row crop farming, by which I mean corn, soy, wheat, sorghum. These are huge crops. The people who farm it, it's like thousands upon thousands of acres. It's not like some old guy, like tilling the field with an ox. It's very much like an industrial operation. And so they have these problems where it's like overseeing all those crops is very difficult actually. And so requires like more and more technology. So I did a lot of stuff like that. So smart tractors, drones that would check the soil albedo, and then eventually I got into fish farming as well because it's a similar problem. Because people who run big fish farms, like it's very hard for them to keep track of all the fish and the health of the fish and things of that nature. So that kind of became my niche, as it were, which is very interesting.
huh.
And it's funny because that's kind of how I got into Urbit. This is kind of a weird segue, but like I found out about Urbit like a lot of people actually, which is that I read Hacker News, and Hacker News is like, fuck Urbit. And I was like, okay, well, seems pretty cool to me because all these nerds on Hacker News don't like it. So there's got to be something to it. By the way, that was kind of like the first I saw of the like engineering culture divide between LA and San Francisco, which I thought was kind of interesting. Like LA, it's very based in the defense industry because big defense contractors are there, Caltech is there, JPL is there. JPL is basically a part of the defense industrial complex. Whereas in San Francisco, it's a lot more consumer gigas, fucking dating apps and garbage like that.
Yeah, apps and
Yeah.
shit.
And so
Yeah.
it's sort of like I didn't realize that the kind of LA engineering culture was so different and in my opinion preferable to like kind of like VC shit type engineering culture. But I saw Urbit and I was like, oh, this would actually be a very interesting way to like run hardware, run robots, things of that nature. Because at the time I was working on this project where we were deploying these things that monitored fish farms that were all over the coast of Norway with very shitty, very intermittent internet networking in general. And so you kind of run across these problems where you're like, things that you take for granted in a dense urban area, like the kind of assumptions that like someone who builds Uber has about their network just doesn't work for like, in my opinion, real stuff. Like people who do military stuff, people who do agricultural stuff, mining, things like that, where it's like being done in the hinterlands. So you have to have, I mean, just to be concrete, it's like we like collect gigabytes, terabytes of imagery of fish, for example, and then we would try to deploy new software to the units, and it was like very hard to tell at any time like what software was running where. If you have a whole bunch of images, like how do they map to the software that's running at that time? All the meta, just keeping it all together is kind of a hard task. So I saw something like Urbit as being interesting in that if you have this different networking model and kind of like more, let's say, sturdy software stack that you're building on, would that help you address some of these problems? And so that's kind of like why I got into Urbit in the first place, was to solve that. And like little did I know that we had to solve like, 8 years of other problems to, to be able to do that. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into it to begin with.
So how long were you with that company?
I was probably with that company about 5 years, I want to say.
And then you started learning about
Yeah.
Urbit. How then did you get introduced to like Tlon?
Well, I joke sometimes that every great company starts as like, you've done HR before, the term time theft. It's one of my favorite terms. It's like,
Oh, of course,
it's
yeah.
just like I was committing a little time
My
theft,
favorite thing to do.
right? Where I was just like, nominally billing all these hours to, I won't say which large corporation, but like it really, I was just like hanging out in the Urbit chat room and just like, shit posting with these people. It was funny, right? Because Urbit at that time really was just like one chat room. And Curtis and Galen were just in that room all the time,
What kind of shit went on in there? What was
Well, I
discussed?
mean, it's interesting. What's interesting about it is that like very little about Urbit was discussed. I mean, there was the occasional Urbit question, but it was like the chat had no scroll back, so you could only see like, the last 100 messages or so. And there was like it was not super clear when the messages had been sent, if that makes sense. So it was like hard to tell if the chat was alive or dead at any time. So you kind of just like,
So there were no like
yeah,
timestamps
exactly.
or
I think there was, but
yeah,
like it was
okay.
like you really had to like look at it. So it's kind of one of those things where you'd come into the chat room and be like, "What's up, everyone?" And then everyone would have to like fill you in and on what had happened over the last. Does that make sense? Like it's a very weird.
Yeah, you're constantly like, what did
Yeah,
I
what did I
miss?
miss?
You know?
And so I think just that
Yeah.
mechanism itself led to this very kind of like I don't know, cohesive, whatever. It's just like people were very helpful and very kind of like each one teach one type vibe. And sometimes that
Mm.
person would be Curtis, or it would be Galen, or it would be one of the other three people that work there at Tlon. And then also there was just like this beginning of like very specific cultural references, very few of which I think that's the mistake people think is they think that like it was like a Curtis Yarvin appreciation society, and it really wasn't. It's hard to get people to believe that, but like we were not sitting there discussing the benefits of techno monarchy or whatever. It was just like you know what I mean. It was just like kind of like books that we liked and like suggesting things to people, and it very quickly became the kind of like highest signal place to ask like any question. You know what I mean? So you would be like, hey, like have you guys read any good books lately? Or do you guys have any, recommendations for things in this direction? And you'd get back an answer that was just like bonkers, right? And that you never would have arrived at before. Even then, it was like that was like the most interesting chat room on the internet, certainly. And so, yeah, and that was kind of the vibe. And there was, if you had a random question about Urbit, you could ask it there, and like there was basically no documentation. So you basically just had to go in the chat and ask, which I think was actually very good in some ways.
You're actually like interact to get information. Do you have any sense of like how many people were, regularly?
Well,
I mean, I assume there was sort of like a core
yeah,
group
I mean there was
of people
probably like
outside of the
25
team.
people maybe, including like the 5 people that worked on Urbit full time. And what's funny is that at that time there was a way to go to the Urbit website and then to just like post anonymously from there. So you'd have also like drive-by people that would just like spam the chat with like various unrepeatable things, so who would get like bullied out of the whole thing. So imagine you're trying to have a conversation about like the various like high and low points of whatever literature, and then someone's just like, you're like, you just have to sort of like
Well,
yell them out of the
how
room.
how did that work? I don't understand how that would
So, meaning like technically, how
how
did you do that?
yeah, I don't get
Well,
that.
so Urbit used to work a little bit different at that time, but it's basically, I mean, so Mark has reintroduced this like very recently, the ability to join from a browser, and it would make a comment. Does that make sense? Like it would make like
Mhm.
essentially a
Mhm.
throwaway identity, and basically that existed in Urbit a long time ago, and Mark recently has like revived that. But that's basically how it works. So the browser would generate a comment, which is kind of like a
Oh, I see.
throwaway random key. So you could never even tell, if some random person joined via the browser twice, you wouldn't even know it was the same person. So it was kind of had this interesting 4chaniness occasionally. I don't know. It's kind of like you can imagine like you're in a signal group and then like 4chan can just like yell into your chat every once in a while. It's a very bizarre dynamic. So I was hanging in this room and I was just like, no one had told me that like Urbit was impossible to develop on. And so I basically made this like very rudimentary task management app and got it running and everything. And I was like going to San Francisco for the weekend, and there happened to be a meetup. And so I was just sort of like talking to the guys, and I was like, blah, blah, whatever. I'm going to be up in San Francisco. I'll see you guys there. And then like the day before, and I've been talking about this app I had made, and then the day before, Galen DMs me or messages me. He's like, "Dude, I'm suffering from gastrointestinal distress. Can you give the talk at the meetup about your thing?" And I was like, okay." So I show up and I give this demo, and then Curtis was like, "How did you do this? Like how did you do this? Because like we don't, there's basically no documentation. There's no documentation. There's no this. There's no that." And I basically was just like, I just fucking brute forced it, you know? Like I just was not too stupid to give up. So I just sort of like basically just crashed a million ships and just did it until it worked. And I think that's kind of like when I became, part of the community, as it were.
So Galen got a tummy ache and you became
Exactly. I
famous.
became
Urbit
urban famous.
famous.
And,
Okay.
and I think at that meetup, actually, that was like I think Josh was there, Ted was there, and this is before either of them worked on Urbit. So it was like a very kind of like pivotal meetup, as it were. And it was in the original Tlon office, which like looked basically like a crack den. I don't know if you remember this one. It was like in the mission.
It's like in the
It was in the
mission.
mission,
Yeah.
and it was in this like storefront that looked abandoned, that just had this sign that said Ictus. And it was like there was really no indication whatsoever that this was like a habitable place. And I walk in and like, Keaton's there and Mark was there and Galen was there and Curtis was there and yelling at
Wow.
people in the kitchen, and just that was the vibe. And there was a really like just surprisingly nice garden in the back. So it's kind of like an abandoned building that had a really nice garden. It was very Tawny in that way. And yeah, that's kind of like where I met the gang. And then basically I just was, from then on, was like, dude, I gotta work on this. Like this is my thing, But then of course they had no money, Like it was just like there was literally no
Hmm.
money. And I'm pretty sure like most of the employees were working for free or were like sleeping in the office or something. But I just kept in touch. And then when they raised money, Galen called me. He's like, dude, you know how to manage people. So you can be the guy that does the non-technical management, I mean, technical management, but deadlines. This is not things that were like really part of the Tlon culture. And that's what I came on full time.
So that was like early 2018, maybe?
I think more like 2017. I want to say, 'cause I feel like it
17?
was pretty soon after the election, which shook the world. You know what I mean? Because I just remember like even my workplace, which was like relatively apolitical, becoming more and more kind of like intolerable in some ways. And I just remember that very distinctly. I was like, I can't deal with this shit. Like I have a very low tolerance for, as you know, keeping my mouth shut. And so I was like, I gotta leave. And so I remember that quite distinctly. So I think it was like 2017, about there.
So you're kind of implying like you also wanted to work with,
So just say
how
it.
do I say
Just
this?
say it. I'm an asshole. Yes. Are you an asshole? Yes, I'm an asshole.
No, no, like you basically you said it, like you'd reach sort of like your tolerance level for like a certain sort of tone in the workplace or like whatever. You were looking for like a totally different type of gang to work with, as well as being interested in Urbit, obviously wanting to work on it. I mean, I imagine like the people part of it was a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's like what people maybe don't. I mean, things have shifted so much since then. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to like even explain in some ways, but I blessedly have never worked someplace where I actually had to like not say retard in the chat. You know what I mean? Like I've never worked in such a place. I haven't, thank God. I've
Mm.
never really worked someplace where I had to like really toe a line. Some of that's, I would say, by design, or just because like I feel it coming very early and I avoid it, if that makes sense. Like it's not even about espousing. Like I wasn't like, oh, I got to work with based people. I just like, it's hard to explain, but there's this very distinct like chilling effect that happens, I think, in a lot of places, especially even places that like don't really think about themselves as having a culture, that I just find like instantly intolerable. And I don't like that feeling. And I feel like it ends up being really damaging for work, because it's like you got to be able to trade ideas freely and feel comfortable expressing yourself. That's really crucial for a satisfactory work environment. And I value that very highly, obviously. And I'm really, I think, blessed that I've never had to really compromise on that, because the way I always think about it is like you spend most of your like, waking life working, right? And if you're gonna, and I don't mean like, I don't think I'm like an edge lord. I don't think I'm like offensive. I don't need to do that. But it's like also the idea of spending your work life like double checking what you're saying. It's just not a good use of your mental energy.
Do you think that it's gotten, I mean, it seems like an easy question, but I'm not sure actually it is. Do you think it's gotten much worse or much worse bending in the other direction? Or is
At
it,
Tlon,
what
or
do you
just
think
like in the
about that?
world?
No, like in general in the world.
Um,
Because sometimes I can't tell. Like sometimes I'm like, this is obviously so much worse. But then sometimes I'm like, I don't know. It kind of seems like people are like generally starting to like,
I mean, I only know kind of like second or third hand from like people that have worked at big places in terms of
Hmm.
how much kind of like, I don't know, self censorship they do. And that's the thing that everyone should know about Urbit and Tlon is like very early we started to benefit from these kinds of I mean, people forget like James Damore, that kind of like purge at Google. We benefited from that. I think all these projects kind of in our quote unquote space do the outflow of competent people from these places that just don't want to live like that. And so you do get the occasional report. And I think that what's happened is that it's just really stratified. I think it's like if you want
Hmm.
to be like an upper middle management at Google, it's like you're at Communist Party level thought policing. You know what I mean?
Well, at least publicly.
Well, but I mean, yeah, publicly, all your internal communication. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, maybe those people are,
Yeah.
in my experience, the people that are able to maintain that level of adherence to a speech policy are not like secretly, based. They're just like, because that just tires everyone out. It's like the people; those are just like the
Mm.
true believers, strivers, like who just don't really give a shit, and they'll just say whatever. And so, but on the other hand, I think you do have like the before it was like there was kind of this middle tier of workplaces that kind of like felt like they needed to comply with that. And I think that has kind of like, in some ways, the fringes are growing thicker, I guess is the best way I would say it, right? It's like you have the core of the kind of like extreme, almost like parodic woke Google, Apple, whatever these morons are. But like the fringe now includes like bigger and bigger like just bigger by market cap things, right? That don't have those restrictions. So I think it's changed a lot for people that are in our kind of ambit, but not for like people who are like having meetings with Nancy Pelosi. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also that sort of policing is so oppressive that as the fringes get deeper and deeper, there's or thicker, what as you said, like it's clear that there's so much more overlap among these particular groups or whatever. I've sort of worked lots of different places that have different vibes. I would say I've definitely like seen that stuff more. I don't know. It's annoying, but I also get annoyed by like base off, based off. It's like not face off, but base off. Like it's
No,
just
it's
I'm
it's
like
it's
okay,
it's
like
it's very yeah.
like can't you just
Just
be
be
can't
cool.
people just be like just be cool? Yeah. As you told me in the instructions to before this space, you said just try to be cool. So
Well,
yeah,
well,
that's
I
what
think I think that
I just want people
there's
to
like
be
a
cool.
deeper dynamic there, which is that like, and I say this reporting from a Midwestern college town, which is like the most parodically woke place I've ever been in my life. You see this a lot where you kind of like it's a very beta activity, if that makes sense, to try to conform to the social signals of what you consider your betters to be. If you live in Lawrence, Kansas, you have an idea in your mind of what it means to be like a San Franciscan NPR listener, and that's what you're aspiring to be. Like it's with your whole heart, you want to be that. And so you do like a parody of that, right? You're like, I'm gonna put all the stickers on Earth on my Subaru. I'm with her. They're just like,
In this car,
yeah,
we
in this
believe.
I believe it's and but ultimately it's like even I don't even know the Google like CEO. What I mean, he's not even the CEO. Whoever the commissar at that runs Google is, like even to probably her, right? It's like the residents of Lawrence, Kansas, with their Subarus covered with stickers are like repugnant, right? Because they're obviously striver betas. And I think the same,
Hmm.
but I mean, the same thing is true of like the based industrial complex as well, right? I mean, if you're going out of your way to show your like based bona fides by like, dropping the latest crime statistics in the chat, and it's like, then you're really just demonstrating that you're a beta in that realm, if that makes sense. Of course, those are betas that I have slightly more kind of like I think they're funnier, so I approve them a little bit more. But also, it's like at the end of the day, and this is kind of one of the things that Galen and Curtis, even to his credit, right? I mean, people don't give him enough credit actually for this kind of stuff. He was like, ultimately, you don't want that in any direction, you know. And so, working
Hmm.
at Tlon, working on Urbit in the early days, like I mean, you can attest there was very little of what I would consider to be kind of like dorkish beta discussion. I mean, it was kind of just like the vibe was always to be like slightly aloof from it, right? You wouldn't like,
Hmm.
there'd be an offhand comment about, Hillary Clinton's pantsuit, but it wasn't like we were there sitting around.
I mean, if
If even,
even,
I mean,
like, I feel like it was more just sort of like open-hearted freaks being themselves and doing strange things on machine.
yeah,
There have been other times where it felt more bassy, whatever. But it's funny because Tlon actually, I mean, lots of different phases, always many things to learn and improve on, but actually one of the most sort of humane places that I've ever worked. And I just think that's really interesting. I think some of the places that are like the most kind of like restrictive about sort of like thought crime are the worst places to work and the most sort of like demented. So I don't know exactly why that is, but I mean, it certainly isn't. It's not a surprise, and that's been my
well, I mean,
experience.
I think that part of it is that, especially from the early days. So I came on basically when Curtis was still there, obviously. And by the fact that I was kind of like the only manager type person, it was like I ended up conferring with Galen and Curtis quite a bit about things. And then when Curtis left, I became an officer of the company. And so I feel like a lot of that stuff, I was part of it, let's say, in setting the tone, I would say. And one thing that Galen, I think, really convinced me of, and Curtis was on board with too, is that doing something like Urbit is it takes a long fucking time, and
Hmm.
you just can't burn yourself out. And I think that's the kind of thing where, like, if you have that mindset, it's almost incomprehensible to outsiders, right? Especially people who are like interested in financial cycles and stuff. And the overlap with
Hmm.
the crypto world is like very short sighted, obviously. So it's hard to understand, but I think a lot of the culture was based around that. It's like we can't burn ourselves out. We can't get sick of this project. We can't get sick of the work environment because it's not worth it. I mean, some things that move so fast, it's like, by the time you're sick of it, it's over. It's going to last forever. It's going to
Hmm.
take forever to actually do right. And so I think that was part of it, just like that culture. And like, I think that's very good, actually. And of course, people get frustrated with it,
I think
but what are you going to do?
I mean, I think it's true, and I think like anyone who thinks or ever thought this was going to be a quick thing, they've long since sort of like fucked
Yeah.
off. And sometimes sometimes people kind of like enter the community thinking like now's the time, and then like they eventually like fizzle. I think like that's happens over and over again. And I don't really necessarily think of that as, I mean, it's obviously not churn in the sense of like you quote unquote user churn, but it's kind of that. If you don't know like what it is, and me as a non-technical person, there are many, many things that I'll never understand, but I understand enough to know that like that ain't it. And if that's what you're looking for, like you're probably not in the right place. I also think like there's a big generosity in this community toward children and
Yeah.
family, and I think that makes a huge difference too. And it allows people to kind of like when I joined, which is like shortly after you, Curtis also hired me, many like young men who now have families and children are still involved, like it allows people to kind of like grow and feels like they're supported in that, and I think that's a really big
Oh
deal.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's like the kind. I mean, and what's funny though, I mean, and I don't want to like take any credit, but I mean, we were really, I think, one of the few that had that attitude early on. I think, and it's funny now because I'm more hooked into like the defense scene and like the guys doing their stuff down in El Segundo, and and like some of these people that are very concerned about fertility, just whatever population decline. All this stuff has kind of become more and more on people's forefront. We didn't do it for any like political reason. It's just that like I have a son, Galen has a son. We all have kids. Karina has kids. It's like that's just natural to us. But I think that's like we were ahead of the curve in some ways, and I think also I think there's an LA culture of engineering that is more based in defense, like I said, and like that actually skews quite a bit older because like to be able to build a fucking rocket, like you need to have a lot of experience. This is not the kind of thing where you're just going to be some like dipshit, 21-year-old dropout. That's not how this works. And so you just get like a more like I want to say circumspect engineering culture in some ways, and that's I think more aligned with Urbit in some ways, and that this is like a very serious engineer. I mean, the one thing you could say about it, it's a very serious engineering feat, right? To build this kind of thing. It's
Hmm.
not the kind of
Hmm.
thing that if your mindset is like, selling clicks to the Chinese. Like, this is not the fucking thing for you. And I think that is just like the fact that we can keep people through their whole career and attract older people that have families. It is an advantage when you're doing something like what we do.
I mean, I think like one thing we need to improve on is like just helping. Well, I don't know how. I mean, we talk about this a lot internally, sort of like that career path thing, so that people really understand like how. I mean, we all take a risk. It's like it's not a stable. We're not. I've worked for the government. This is not the government. It's never going to be like that, right? But just helping to identify like career pathways and development. I think one of the best things is sort of like having senior devs like mentor and let more junior people actually experiment with a lot of things and just like get right into it and learn a lot. And that's absolutely how you like grow people into amazing engineers who are going to stick
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's like the real answer there is that in the world that we all live in now, which is not confined to Tlon, or it's just like the realities of how people
Mm-mm.
like work is they bounce around all kinds of places, right? And you have to think about career development as like what skills are you learning at every level as opposed to like titles. And that's the kind of thing that I
Mm.
think is like people are kind of ill-equipped to think about. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm a junior dev and then I'm going to become a senior dev and then I'm going to become a, those are not
Mhm.
very informative titles, right? And this is why I think one thing that we talked about early days at Tlon, which I think is there's something too is kind of larpy at the time, is this like approaching software more as like a guild. Which, I'm sorry, that sounds so cringy, but you know what I mean? It's like if you're a blacksmith in a guild, it's like
Mhm.
the junior, whatever they're called, the apprentice blacksmiths,
Like an apprentice,
they
yeah.
do the blacksmithing for the most part, right? And the journeymen who are above that decide what to blacksmith, or you know what I mean? And then the masters are the ones that like hire new of those things, right? They find new apprentices and they elevate people from apprentice to journeyman. And thinking about these crafts more like that, like you got to do it, and then only by doing it do you earn the right to like design it. That's one way you could do it. And I think it's kind of like more suitable to the kinds of things that we do nowadays, not just at Tlon, but it's just like everywhere, where it's a fucking mess, right? It's like you one job you do Solidity, the other job you do this, you do whatever, you work all these places.
Well, and I think it's also important, like those things help build like a depth
Yeah,
where, it's surprising to me, like when we talk to, maybe people who are interested in working with us or, they come from a different type of, as I like to call them, computer place.
internet
They're
business.
still, right, internet business. They're still, kind of looking for, like what's the career ladder, and I just don't really necessarily think that makes a lot of sense. I really think it should be. I like your analogy. Is that an analogy? I didn't go
Yeah,
to
no,
graduate
it's a
school.
metaphor. It's a metaphor.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, metaphor. I think that actually is a really good way to put it and makes a lot of sense just in the real
Well,
world.
I think the problem is, and it's funny because people who are dropouts intuitively understand this, but people who are kind of like
Mm,
organization people, which is like college is basically a fucking machine. It's like an extension of the government. It's like they're very used to this idea of levels of certification, and like really the good thing about the dropout is like I have no fucking certification. I need to prove that I can do all this stuff, and so they're very comfortable with the idea of the skill being kind of like the unit of measure as opposed to the title. And I
mm,
think that's the kind of thing that people are getting better at almost just by because they have to, just because like the job market is getting so fucking weird. There's all this churn and weird stuff. And so I think people are kind of coming around to that idea. Like, listen, you're going to come work at Tlon, and the first 2 years, you're going to do this, and you're going to get better at this kind of thing. And then you're going to work, and then you're going to get better at this kind of thing. And at the end, that'll be stuff that'll be useful to the next place you go, if you leave. That just seems like an easier sell to someone who's like dropped out of college, right? Than someone who is, kind of worked their way through the system.
I think it's so true too about like just the experience that you have working on whatever it is. It builds into making you sort of a more well-rounded human being that then can also like think about operational things, or think about, like things that actually like are very helpful and useful, like as you kind of move through life, your working life. I don't know. I like to talk about my dad because he was like just interesting. But like, he's barely graduated. I don't even think he did graduate from high school, actually. Like got a job as a truck driver by basically scamming his way into a
My kind of
truck.
guy.
You
My kind of
know,
guy.
yeah, exactly. Con man energy. Like, learned how to be a gaffer, became an electrician, started using cameras, became a cameraman. You know what I mean? Like that's how his career developed. And my experience is like a little bit that way, but like way more circuitous. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to do things. We also like you and I both know many highly educated, very talented engineers.
I think that like in a lot of ways the like Y Combinator Silicon Valley model of engineering and business has just been an epic fucking disaster. And I think one of the many ways that it's like skewed things is that engineers think too highly of themselves. Sorry, engineers on the call, but I mean it's like people think that engineering is enough. And in my experience, it's like every soft skill that people think someone just dropped off the call like fuck this, I don't need to be,
Fuck you.
no,
Yeah.
but it's like every soft skill that people think is like beneath contempt, let's say, like being able to get people to like you, like being able to explain things, right? Being able to maintain relationships, being able to, this and that. It's like that is what will actually propel you to the higher heights of any industry, not being really, really good at using fucking whatever technology. That's just the reality of the situation. And being a good leader, right? Being a good communicator. And I think it's kind of like a huge disservice to young people because they think that if they just engineer hard enough, eventually they'll make $1 zillion. And that's actually not the case. Like in my experience, there's a lot more salesmen who have started, gajillion-dollar companies than there have been engineers that have started gajillion-dollar companies. And if they are engineers, they learned pretty early on that like they have to become salesmen. That's the kind of thing where I really would like to see that change and people be like, look, engineering is a great way to get a job. But if you want to like be a leader, be something, be the master of your destiny, you got to do all these soft things that you don't learn. If you don't do them naturally, you got to just learn them through the reps. The system that we have now, it encourages people to become engineers because engineers are like, meat to put in the grinder, as it were. They want young kids that are good at programming so that they can like burn them out and then throw them away. And I think that's
Right.
really kind of like a detriment.
Well, and they don't, that's kind of what I mean about like learning operational things, learning about the business, learning,
Yeah.
how to not be an asshole. It's a disservice to, I think, young people that are trying to figure this
And,
stuff
and
out.
that I think probably is one of the good things about like working in a small company is that you almost can't avoid it. And that's I think one of the best things about working in a small group. It's like if you're a company of 3 people, you learn very quickly that someone's got to go raise money, and that is a soft skill. You guys are not going to be in business in 6 months if no one raises money. And I think that's really good for people just to be exposed to that.
Well, yeah, and like HR, it's like, when we started actually doing quote unquote HR at Tlon, it was like, that's ridiculous. We don't need that. But it's actually there, it exists for a reason. And one of the things you need to do if you're running a business is not get shut down for stupid reason.
Not getting sued is like the zeroth mandate.
So because you're too
Yeah.
based to, like learn anything about how it works,
They haul you in
like
front of
that's good luck.
the judge. He's like, sorry, I'm too based. Like, yeah.
I'm too
Anyway.
based, excuse me for being too based.
Okay. Well, I think we're gonna have to wrap this up because I'm getting word
All right.
from my engineer that we're running over time. But Roslet, always a pleasure. Great
Always.
talking. I will be moving back to California in the next few months.
I know, I can't wait to bother you
We'll
and
be you can
vice
bother
versa.
me from the same time zone. So